straightanswerflorida.org.
Hello everyone and welcome to Straight Answer Florida. My name is Steve Bussey and today we're speaking with Fred Galey, Brevard County former Supervisor of Elections and a retired military officer. And we're speaking about ethics in government, nepotism, cronyism, the appearance of impropriety, and the appearance of a conflict of interest. Hello Fred, welcome to.
Hi Steve, I'm glad to be here.
So, as an Air Force officer, you're familiar with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations.
Absolutely.
And that's the agency I retired under. And I think, you know, it's important to know I haven't been in public office, I haven't run for office, but when I was a special agent for 12 and a half years, and Fred, you know the rules in the Air Force for conflict of interest.
Absolutely.
In the OSI, we lived in a glass house that was literally millimeters thin. It's an ultra-conservative organization. And we had to be concerned not just with impropriety or actual conflicts. Our rule of thumb was always the appearance of a conflict, the appearance of impropriety. The appearance of an impropriety was an impropriety in and of itself. And I think as an Air Force officer, you're probably familiar with that standard.
Oh, absolutely. Everything we did was, you know, I lived in a glass house also. And in fact, you know, if I would drive the car off base sometimes, they would call in to report where I was at, so I understand totally how the glass house.
They probably called my office.
Full disclosure is the most important thing.
Full disclosure, and I'm glad you said that, Fred. That's where I want to go today. We're going to talk about a little bit about cronyism, nepotism, ethics in government, and of course, we're discussing all this in the era of the Tea Party movement, where people are demanding more ethics in government. People are demanding austerity. People are demanding full disclosure these days. It's not the politics of old. And we have several contentious elections here in Brevard County. And one of those elections, of course, is the County Property Appraiser's office. And there's several people running for that office. The incumbent is Jim Ford. Dana Blickley is running, and I understand she's a former employee of the office. We have Jason Steele, the former real estate commissioner for the state of Florida under Jeb Bush. And there's some issues that have been raised in this race that really go to the heart and soul, I think, of ethics in government. Now, this is from a report by WFTV television out of Orlando from 2008, and it deals with Jim Ford, our current incumbent property appraiser. And I'm going to quote from their article here. Quote, Ford is using a program called DROP. Now, DROP, as people might know, is a way to retire from Florida public service, law enforcement, teachers, firefighters, but also, at the time, constitutional officers, politicians. It's a program where you can officially be retired, but stay on the job collecting your salary. Now, what Ford did, as people remember, as we talked about, he ran for re-election. He was re-elected. 2 days later, he retired, stayed out of office 30 days, and then was sworn in as the property appraiser. Now, by doing that, according to WFTV in Orlando, he got a lump sum check of $337,192, and he'll also get a retirement check of $6,892 a month. Now, that's in addition to his $139,000 a year salary. Now, part of the problem with that is, there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, he didn't tell the voters that he was going to do that. I don't think he came up with this plan suddenly by saying, wow, I won re-election. Oh yeah, let me retire and then go back in and get sworn in. I can do that. I think he had this plan all along. And to me, as an old fraud agent, like we just said, the fraud is in the failure to disclose. Now, I don't want to say he committed a crime. Everything he did was completely legal. But in the court of public opinion during an election, I think he committed a fraud by failing to disclose certain relevant information that the voters would have needed, that he was going to retire and enhance his own financial position by swearing back in. Do you see that, Fred, as an issue, as a problem?
Yeah, it's an issue. I remember when I was first elected, my wife was working in the supervisor's office at the time. And one thing that I had said and one thing that she did, she retired before I ever took office. And that was the only way I'd ever have it, because, you know, how can you supervise your own wife? And, you know, you'll have the conflicts at home, but you don't need them at the office.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's sort of how I felt about that. And I've noticed that even in the paper yesterday, you know, people that have retired and come back to the same position.
Mm-hmm.
There's over 200 in the state from the constitutional officers and several hundred other of the state employees.
Yeah, I know it's legal. But there is, to me, such a thing as abusing a system, using a system. I don't necessarily have a problem if a sheriff's deputy, a teacher, a firefighter goes into what's known as the drop program to retire or gets hired back. I don't necessarily have a problem with that because I understand that program was instituted to fill gaps in law enforcement, firefighting, and teachers. I do have a problem, though, when an elected official does it, a policymaker, a person responsible for our tax dollars. And I have a problem with it when they don't disclose that during their campaign. I seriously doubt, and I don't want to make, you know, criminal allegations here because, like I said, he appears to have followed the law. But as a voter and a taxpayer, I certainly feel like I was defrauded when the guy can enhance his salary in the same position by something like 2/3 or 3/4 by retiring and swearing back in. And he didn't tell us he was going to do that. And we vote in this election thinking the salary for this office is X amount of dollars, and now suddenly it goes up exponentially, and I do have a problem with that. But, you know, Fred, you just brought up your wife worked in the office when you were elected. I understand there was also a pretty big lawsuit here involving Jim Ford and Dana Blickley, and it involved, my understanding is, the sitting property appraiser, Jim Ford, had an affair with a temporary employee in the office. And that affair was exposed by Dana Blickley, who's now running against him. And she was, how shall I say it, encouraged to resign. And there was a lawsuit that followed that. It cost the taxpayers of Brevard, maybe I've seen reports in the media of upwards of $600,000. I think she sued to assert her First Amendment rights in the workplace. But then eventually Jim Ford divorced, married this temp employee at some point during this chain of events. She was elevated to a permanent full-time employee and is still there and may even be supervised by Mr. Ford. Having been there, Fred, is that a problem?
Well, I think it can be a problem. You know, the thing about it is with ethics, I've always been told, and the way I felt was, you don't do anything that you wouldn't want to see on the front page of the newspaper. And that's one of the things as far as disclosure is concerned. You know, you're running for office, you're supposed to do the top job you can for the people that elected you to serve. And it just sometimes becomes a real conflict when you're trying to work a lot of things that create additional pressures and conflicts in supervision and in the job performance.
You know, people throw the words nepotism and cronyism around, and there's a lot of room in politics to make that allegation, but I think the fact, and you might know this from having been in politics, when you're in politics, there's a circle of people that you know, that you trust, people that you go to seek advice, people that you know can do certain things. And when you get elected to office, I really don't have personally a problem with you bringing some of those people into your inner circle or even hiring them. But I think you cross the line when you have an inter-office affair and then you marry that person and that person continues to work there. You know, one of the things I learned as a corporate loss prevention specialist was that sexual harassment complaints can be made by a third party. There's, let's say, a young lady or a young man in the workplace sees another employee having an affair with the boss, the manager, and so on. And that third party employee feels maybe they're not getting ahead because that other person has such a close relationship with the boss. So that third party can make, legitimately, legally, a sexual harassment complaint. Isn't that the setup we have going on in the property appraiser's office right now with Jim Ford's wife being there? And because of his previous contact when they were having the affair.
Well, you know, I've seen the articles in the paper and don't have any specific knowledge of that, but I do know that the office staff that I worked with, we had the type of relationship that if any one of us would get out of line, somebody else would whack them across the head because, you know, that's the ethics of the way we worked, you know. And so, you know, my staff and the people that I worked with, we didn't hesitate to pull the trigger if we saw something that was wrong because we were there to serve the people, and the only thing we wanted to do was was do the very best job we can and could to treat everybody exactly the same.
Well, Fred, did you have, when you were supervisor of elections, did you have rules in the office about employee dating, employee relationship? Was that anything that ever really came up in your office?
It was nothing that ever came up, and of course their personal life in the office was something that would never cross. What they did outside, I didn't worry about it unless it started to affect the office. Then, since it never came up, it's nothing that I ever had to deal with. But in the military, you had the same thing.
Yeah.
Dating between officers, between enlisted, those
Fraternization.
Kind of
It's called fraternization.
Fraternization is just something
That's
that
right.
was not tolerated. I know things have changed a lot now, but I'm still the old school that what's right is right.
Well, what people don't realize about the military, and you and I were there, like we just said, there's things in the military that you go to jail for that in civilian life you may be fired for, or in civilian life people might not want to vote for you for. What we're used to is, under the UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice, adultery is actually a crime, and it's a crime for a reason. That's our context, that's where we come from. And I don't feel bad as a veteran, as a retired military member who was raised by a veteran, whose father-in-law is a veteran, whose brother is a veteran, whose son is now an Afghanistan veteran, still living under the same rules in the Army that I lived in, under in the Air Force. I don't feel bad holding my elected officials or my political candidates to the same standard I had to live under for 20 years. I mean, I didn't live a perfect life. I've made a lot of mistakes, a lot of bad decisions in my life. But when I was in my professional military career, I lived in that glass house, and I understood the requirements and what may happen due to certain behavior. But I wasn't a policymaker. I wasn't responsible as much for taxpayer dollars as somebody like Jim Ford. But when I was in the OSI, we would never even interview a female suspect in a room alone. You always kept the door open, had another agent with you, just so an allegation couldn't be made. And I think when Jim Ford had this affair in the office, he exposed not just himself to condemnation, but he exposed, like we said, the office, the taxpayers, and the voters of Brevard County to everything that could normally flow from that bad of a decision.
Well, and that's one of the things that I had, in on all the interviews that I did for job hiring, both, some of the things in the military and in the office. We never had a single one-on-one. I always tried to have somebody else there just to avoid any particular chance or type of conflict.
Just so the allegation can't be made.
Absolutely.
Well, you're an old politician and old officer. We've seen things like, who was it, New York Congressman Anthony Weiner and his Twitter account and sending pictures out. And we've seen other people like that. Does this stuff going on in Brevard County fall into that category, Fred? And is this something that taxpayers and voters are just getting so sick and tired of? Don't we deserve better? Don't we have a right to demand better?
Absolutely you do. And with the way the cost of government is going up, we're heading toward the things like in Greece and France, the things that are bothering us in Europe right now that's affecting the economy. So you have to keep an eye on the total cost of government, doing it right, doing the most efficient thing you can at the lowest possible cost, realizing that sometimes in government you can't control the cost like you can in a business.
Right.
But it's still there and something that ethically you have to keep an eye on.
Have you ever felt personally that the legal standard is good enough, or do we have a right and an expectation, a reasonable right and expectation, to hold our elected officials, even the people running for office, to a far higher standard?
Well, I would certainly hope so. A lot of things are legal and some of them are maybe borderline, but you have to have your own personal standard of ethics, and the higher standards you have there, the much better you're off, and the more you'll be restricted by the people that you serve.
Fred, in your time in Brevard County politics, Florida politics, have you seen a case like this before, like we're discussing in the property appraiser's office? Everybody talks about Brevard County good old boy politics, Florida good old boy politics. Have you seen anything in your political career, in your time in political circles around Brevard County, like this before?
No, not that I recall. I'm not really, the supervisor of the elections office is not really the political thing that you might think it is, because the way we have to serve both parties and independent parties and totally everybody. So, yeah, we saw a few things that maybe were questionable statewide, but here in Brevard, no, I wasn't aware of anything.
Well, I mean, you talk about statewide. Are you familiar with the situation with Jim Greer? I understand that trial's coming up.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. That's something that's been in the paper. And since I'm retired, I spend a lot of time looking at the paper and TV and other things.
It's getting very salacious right now. I understand there's allegations flying back and forth about Charlie Crist, homosexuality, payments to Hyatt Affairs, and things like that. And I think this also goes to the point of, holding these people to a higher standard, holding them to a standard above the just the legal limit. I mean, these are the reasons we have to insist on more, on better. I mean, have you been following that situation at all, Fred? Have you?
Well, you touched on some things there that I'm going to taste totally out of.
Okay.
But yes, you do have to hold yourself to a high standard and realize that, hey, the person you're serving is not only the people that elected you, but you have to look in the mirror and say, this is what I'm willing to do, and this is what I hold my standard to, and realize that every time you look in the mirror, you're responsible for what you do.
And speaking of Jim Greer, it was really my sense, and I was on talk radio back then, and I do a lot of research because I'm on talk radio now, and I blog, but my sense of the matter is, I know when Jim Greer resigned, it was allegedly Mike Herodopoulos, maybe the Bush family, got involved with convincing either Charlie Crist or going directly to Jim Greer to have him resign. And there was allegations of backroom deals and payoffs and everything there. And of course, the criminal charges came out later. But my memory of this whole event is that it was really the Brevard Republican and Executive Committee, the Republicans here in Brevard County, that started that whole chain of events, that started those dominoes. Were you politically active back then, Fred? Did you follow that at all?
Well, I followed it in the paper, and the only thing I have to say there is, Mike Herodopoulos, I have total respect for him because I think he's an individual that has served this community and the state with the utmost integrity. We all make mistakes. I've made mine, and he's made his, and if there's anybody out there that hasn't made one, I'd like to meet them. But I just have total respect for those individuals.
I like Mike Herodopoulos. He actually, when I retired from the Air Force, I went back to college, took some classes. He was my history professor. I worked on his, by way of full disclosure, I worked on Mike's first campaign, and I've interviewed him several times on the radio. And he admitted to me on the air, he's not a doctrinaire conservative, if you will. But I think Mike is an honorable and honest man, and so I really didn't believe any of the backroom dealing allegations. But during the time Jim Greer came down, I think it was Jason Steele was the chairman of the Brevard Republican Executive Committee, and really led that effort at great political risk. I remember his head was on the political chopping block. He had to go over to Kissimmee or somewhere before the Republican Party of Florida Ethics Commission. I think he was put on double secret probation, as they said in Animal House, the movie Animal House or something like that. Did you follow all that ordeal with Jason at all?
No, I did not. That was
and I think that was a case where one man survived because he was an honorable man and he adhered to ethics similar to what we had to adhere to in the Air Force. The other man did not survive, Jim Greer, because he wasn't an above-board, honest, and ethical man. And I just think it's another, the only reason I bring it up is I think it's another great example of ethics in government. Look at the mess Jim Greer's in. Look at the mess our state is in, because he didn't keep himself above the situation where allegations could be made. He didn't worry about the appearance of impropriety. He didn't worry about the appearance of a conflict.
Yeah, well, this is one thing that comes up, especially in the supervisor's office, is the photo ID to vote. I know that's controversial right now.
You're not going to make any racist statements, are you, Fred?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm not going to do that. But the photo ID is something that I grew up. You show your driver's license, you show your military ID. Every time you turn around to get on an airplane, you have to show a photo ID, and that's something that was always near and dear to me. That I thought it was good, and I still think it's good, and I realize it's controversial right now. But voting, You know, there's nothing in the Constitution that gives you the right to vote if you read it very carefully. But hey, we're here, and let's stand up and do the right thing.
Well, and the only reason I made the sarcastic comment I did about you making a racist comment is because of what you just said. It is a controversial issue, and it's being called racist for certain states to require a voter ID. But like you, I was raised in the military. I spent 20 years in the military. Everywhere I went, I had to show a photo ID my entire life, and I never felt that that was a problem. But, you know, again, this goes to the issue of ethics in government and all of these sorts of things. If we were a perfect people, I think our founding fathers talked about, if we were a perfectly moral people, you know, governments wouldn't be required. But governments are required because we're not a perfect people. You know, one of the problems I have with libertarians is that libertarianism would require that we all live in a perfect world, and we don't. You know, we have to have government. Government has to have the ability to make certain rules and laws, but we're the ones that pick our government. And we're going to pick that government according to the standards we set. And that government's going to act according to the standards we set and the standards we hold them to. And when we don't insist on our politicians and our candidates living above board, in the open, in the glass house, without the appearance of impropriety, without the appearance of conflict, as the old cliche goes, we get the government we deserve.
We deserve. That's exactly right. I've heard it many times, and I concur with that.
You know, the government, through us, our representative form of government, they're the ones that are going to make the rules, the laws that we all have to live by. So we better have honest, ethical, moral people in those offices. And when you look at cases like Jim Greer, Charlie Crist, I think Jim Ford, I think we taxpayers, we voters, have dropped the ball a little bit and haven't held these people's feet to the fire.
Well, that's what we're planning on doing, and that's where, when it comes your time to vote, think in terms of the ethics and the people that have represented you fairly and honestly, and take that in mind when it comes time to vote.
Now, as an Air Force officer, Fred, you understood the big picture. You know, we puny little enlisted guys used to be told when we questioned orders or something that we didn't understand the big picture. But as an officer, I mean, I assume you understood that your actions affected the greater Air Force, the greater office. There's another thing in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I referenced the UCMJ a while ago with adultery, but isn't there something in the Uniform Code of Military Justice called conduct unbecoming an officer?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, how wide open to interpretation is that?
Really is very broad.
Yeah.
In fact, there's an article in the paper this morning about some cadets at the Air Force Academy that used online information to help them get through an online test.
Right.
And they were specifically told not to do so. That's one of the things that I've always said. Be aware that anything you do, whether you're being watched or not, you got to pretend that somebody's watching you, and only act as if you knew somebody was looking over your shoulder.
Right, an ethical man does the right thing when nobody's looking.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned a while ago, you know, as a politician, don't do something you wouldn't want to see on the front page. I was always told in my life, don't do something you wouldn't want your mother to find out about. But those Air Force cadets shouldn't have had to been told. They should have already known that that was something they shouldn't do. I mean, I apply the standards of the UCMJ standards, conduct unbecoming an officer. I apply that to my political candidates and elected officials. Avoiding the appearance of impropriety, avoiding the appearance of a conflict. I apply those to our elected officials. I don't want these guys to adhere to the minimum legal standard.
No, I think you need to set top, and you got to remember that even the motto from the Air Force Academy was, we don't lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate among us those who do.
Are you an old ring knocker?
No, I'm not, but my son was.
Oh, okay. For everybody out there who doesn't know what a ring knocker is, that's someone in the military who graduated from one of the service academies, the Academy at West Point, the Naval Academy at Annapolis, the Air Force Academy. A ring knocker is an officer who graduated from the academy, and people don't understand those are really the only, well, not the only, but they are regular military officers. People from OTS, ROTC and stuff enter the military as a reserve officer and then eventually become regular. Fred, do you have any final comments about ethics in government, nepotism, cronyism, your standards?
Well, you know, my standard is, like I've said before, you know, always remember you're there to serve the people who elected you, and keep an open door, and straight up do honestly what you have in your heart is the right thing to do, and as long as you do that, you're going to serve properly.
Just to boil it down, the appearance of impropriety, the appearance of a conflict, cronyism, nepotism, hiring relatives, possibly as much as over 10% of our local property appraiser's office, everybody's related to each other. It sounds like West Virginia or something. Apologies to all my good friends from West Virginia. Just an old joke, probably a bad one. But over 10% of the people related to each other. I see that as a problem from a risk management standpoint. I see it as a problem of the constitutional officer doing the hiring, feathering his bed, getting his family members in there to keep that government check coming. And I see it as a comfort and as a safety and security that the taxpayers out there in the private sector, out there working for private companies, just don't have that luxury. And I think it's dishonest. Everything's legal and above board, and I get that. But it's dishonest in the court of public opinion. It's dishonest for constitutional officers to do it. It's just distasteful. And I think we're to a state in American politics, Florida politics, Brevard County politics, where we've got to be better than that. A lot of people in the electorate today want better politics, more from our politicians. It's up to us to put an end to nepotism, cronyism, and demand stronger ethics in government.
Yeah, we got to remember that life's an open book.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Fred. Thanks for coming in today and talking with us.
This one.
He's getting closer.
Oh, hold on. This one.